Greetings and welcome to the Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. I'm Phyllis Hollis, your host. As an extension of my Instagram page, Cerebral Women, this podcast offers insights into the visual art world. I interview artists, mainly artists of color and female artists who will freely articulate what inspires their creativity. In addition, you'll hear interesting perspectives from dedicated art professionals who work with artists and the art institutions that feature them. I'm confident that collectively, these individuals will indeed stimulate your mind as they do our eyes. Please know these interviews are conducted in my Manhattan apartment, so please forgive the background sounds of city life. Welcome to the Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. This episode features Pio Abad, an artist whose work is concerned with the personal and political entanglements of objects. His wide-ranging body of work mines alternative or repressed historical events and offers counter-narratives that draw out threads of complicity between incidents, ideologies, and people. Deeply informed by unfolding events in the Philippines, where the artist was born and raised, his work emanates from a family narrative woven into the nation's story. Pio has exhibited at the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford, England, the 58th Carnegie International Ateneo Art Gallery in Manila, Museum of Contemporary Art in Tokyo, Kadist Gallery in San Francisco, Oakville Galleries in Ontario, the 2nd Honolulu Biennial, the 4A Center for Contemporary Asian Art in Sydney, and Gasworks, London, to name a few. He was recently nominated for the 2024 Turner Prize. Pio's works are part of a number of important collections, including the Tate in the UK, Carnegie Museum of Art in Pittsburgh, Hawaii's State Art Museum in Honolulu, and the Singapore Art Museum. He is also the curator of the estate of his aunt, the Filipino-American artist Pasita Abad. He has co-curated monographic exhibitions on Pasita Abad at the Museum of Contemporary Art and Design, Manila, and Spike Island, Bristol. Enjoy this episode featuring Pio Abad. Pio, welcome to my Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Phyllis, thanks so much for having me. And I'm guessing it's good morning in New York and late afternoon here in London.
Yes.
I'm so happy to be joining you morning/afternoon.
Thank you. Let's start with, when did you first discover your artistic passion?
I think it's something that's always been present. It's more the journey of the decision of whether it's a viable life decision to become an artist than to pursue it. But I think what really helped me was having an artist in the family. And so that sense of possibility of living the life of an artist was always present. Pasita, who is my aunt, my father's sister, she would always have exhibitions and they would always become family affairs. And so that path was always present, even as a young kid. But it took me some time to decide that art school was the right decision for me. And actually, it wasn't until I was 21 that I decided to shift majors and pursue art full time.
That's wonderful that you had the opportunity to do that, to follow your passion.
And I've always had very understanding parents. My parents are both in politics, but I always thought my dad was a frustrated artist. So he always said that I was living the life that he'd wanted to lead. And so having that from the get-go was really important. And I think as a result of that, family has always been at the core of how I approach making art, how I approach thinking about art. And so the stories of my family members have always been woven into the work I make.
Yeah, that's beautiful. So how do you define your practice?
It's funny, when you're at a dinner party and you're asked, so what do you make? The longer I do this, the more it gets quite lengthy because in terms of the actual artworks made, my work ranges from drawing to painting to printmaking, but also it ventures further into sculpture. So bronze, concrete, 3D printed sculpture, and then it ventures even further into the written text and even augmented reality. So the practice really is very wide-ranging. But I think at the core of it, my work is very research-based. It looks into the histories of objects and how I love the idea. I think it was the artist Jan Vo who talked about objects not as things, but as networks of relationships. And I think when I read that in art school, it's something that really struck me. And I think that interest in looking at the stories behind things, of how they're both historical objects, but also personal effects, is something that is at the core of my practice. And so a lot of research that then leads to the actual finished work taking on all these different forms.
Interesting. Can you elaborate on the role of drawing in your work?
So everything really starts with drawing. I think whenever I start conceptualizing an installation or a long-term, some of my projects have gone on for a decade. The core of it, really, I start with the paper, ink, and a pen, and I draw. I draw things. I draw objects. And I think something about that process of translating these objects to the drawn image, it's almost like I'm mapping these things. Often the objects depicted in my work are objects that are part of histories that have been largely forgotten, either out of convenience or either out of purposefully forgotten to deny certain histories have ever happened. So by researching in the archives and discovering these objects and then committing them to paper, it's almost like I'm remapping these objects and they become not just things, but actually it becomes a cartography of histories that need to be remembered or that need to be continuously told. The histories of conquest, the histories of political narratives that are part of kind of darker moments in history. These are the things that I really engage with. And I feel like I have a sense of mission. And maybe that comes from having parents who were involved in the anti-dictatorship struggle in the Philippines in the 1980s. But there's the sense of wanting to bring these histories out, and drawing becomes that initial way of laying those coordinates.
It's interesting. Well, thank you for sharing that with us. How has your technique developed or changed over the years?
I think every project that I do, the work changes. And so I think in terms of technique, the techniques keep on expanding. Like I said, initially drawing is the starting point of the works. But over time, I've turned drawings into silk prints. And so the drawn image suddenly becomes like the motifs on textile. And most recently, in terms of technique, it's about kind of embracing collaborative practices. So I collaborate with my wife, a British jeweler named Frances Wadsworth Jones, and we have a collaborative sculptural practice. So from drawing, the work then kind of moves into 3D printed reconstruction of Imelda Marcos jewelry, and then that then shifts into turning those 3D prints into bronze, and then later on turning those prints into monumental concrete sculpture. So I think the technique keeps on evolving because the histories I want to tell keep on expanding, and the people that I want to involve in my work, I keep on embracing more and more collaborations. So yeah, it's developed considerably in the last, when did I graduate art school? 2007. And it's fun. I think that's the best thing about being an artist. I always say that you have the incredible privilege to be irresponsible with things. And so you can tend to be an irresponsible historian or an irresponsible archaeologist. And so the techniques that come with that irresponsibility is something I really treasure and I really value in this, and granted, very bizarre line of work.
Yeah, I love that. What do you enjoy most about your practice?
I think it's the collaborative aspect of it and the way that when I was beginning at art school, I asked myself, what is the point of adding things to the world? And then with that responsibility, I think I started thinking, how do I add to the world? And what is worth adding to the world? And so that's when I started looking at these gaps in histories. And I think the ability to be able to kind of insert these objects in these historical gaps or narratives that have been hidden or voices that have been silenced, but finding ways to not just excavate those narratives, but actually create things that bring them to the foreground. I think that's the biggest thing that I enjoy the most. And I think that is the biggest contribution I can make as an artist. And I think that actually leads to the work I do with my Aunt Pasita, which we can talk a bit more as we have this conversation. But in a way, my role in curating her work has also been a process of excavating. It just so happens that these family histories that I excavate suddenly become present in art history. And as her work has become more well-known in the US, it's starting to have a contribution in the writing of American art history. And I think to be able to have those contributions is what I treasure the most in this work.
It's very important. So how would you say your Aunt Pasita impacts your work that you do, your practice?
Well, like I said, she was present from when I was a kid. And so that sense of possibility of leading the life of an artist has always been present. But I remember when I was contemplating whether I should carry on with, I think I was doing a management course at the time at university, which is not very artistic, or to pursue doing a fine art course. She was the one that really helped me find art schools abroad. And she told me, because Pasita was an incredible traveler, she had this insatiable desire to experience the world and inhale all of these different traditions and embrace all of these different materials. And she told me when we were sitting down and I was asking for advice, she said, if you want to become an artist, and at the time I was still living in the Philippines where I grew up, she told me, and I'm not sure I can swear in this podcast, but she said,
Yes, feel free.
If you want to be an artist, get the fuck out of Manila.
Love that.
And because that is what she did. Initially, Pasita was, like I said, we come from a very political family. And initially, because she's a very gregarious character, you would see this in all the numerous kind of exuberant portraits of her as an artist. And everyone assumed in the family that she would pursue a life in politics, like my grandfather and my grandmother. And initially, actually, when she was still studying university in Manila, she was doing political science. And she got involved in student politics when the Marcos dictatorship was on the rise. And as a result of her political involvement, she got caught in the crosshairs of the dictatorship and had to leave. There was this quite frightening episode in the late 60s where our family home was machine gunned from end to end.
Oof.
Because Pasita was involved in activism and because my grandfather was a member of the opposition. And as a result of that quite frightening, not quite, very frightening moment, she ended up leaving Manila with a view to study law in Madrid, to pursue further studies in Madrid. And on the way to Madrid, she had a stopover in San Francisco. It was the summer of love, and that changed her life. She ended up staying in San Francisco, and from that point, began this incredible journey to become Pasita Abad as we knew her, this sort of incredible global artist who, like I said, inhaled the world and celebrated it in her incredible large-scale paintings. And so going back to that question, I ended up leaving Manila and moving to Glasgow in Scotland, because as you do, quite a big shift. But I think without her encouragement, I don't think I would have done that. And that decision changed my life. I ended up living in Glasgow at the time when it was really kind of an epicenter of cultural movement in the UK. It was the early 2000s, the music scene was incredible, and Glasgow had this incredible DIY scene where you would see artists opening galleries in their bedrooms. And a few years later, these same artists would be nominated for the Turner Prize. And so I think that being given that challenge to go, get the fuck out of Manila, with what I needed to be able to pursue this whatever you call it, work, life. And that's where I also met my partner, Francis, at university. So it really changed my life, that one bit of crude advice.
Yes, it's good advice.
Yeah.
Are there thoughts or concepts that connect your work with Pasita's?
I think our work formally is very different. I think like I said, my work is very research-based, and often it takes the form of kind of museum-like installations where objects mimic the display of kind of museum artifacts, whereas Pasita's are these monumental, she called them trapunto paintings because they're monumental quilted paintings that depict everything from like underwater life to indigenous masks to kind of social realist tableaus. But I think what brings both our works together is this commitment to political histories and this commitment to finding ways to seduce people towards knowing about these histories.
Very interesting. Wow. Huh. When you refer to her paintings, what materials did she use in her work?
I think the question is more, what didn't she use? Because she used everything. I think we were talking and you said you'd had the privilege to see her work at PS1 because there's been a traveling museum exhibition of her work that just finished in New York, and we're about to open it in its final stop at the Art Gallery of Ontario in Toronto. And this retrospective largely centers on her trapuntoed works, which are really like, they're paintings, but there's so much more because she was such a material omnivore. Every painting would have like buttons, all these collected textiles, and she would incorporate these textiles in her works. There's one painting with like an actual house painting brush sewn onto it. There's another painting with a pair of jeans attached to it, or like a Chicago Bulls baseball cap attached to it. She used everything. And I think as much as she became well known for this painting, she also made ceramics. She did a lot of drawings. There's like one, I think she's dabbled in metal sculpture. So I think maybe that's where both our practices also intersect, that the materials that we use become so varied because we want to talk about the world, and the world is so varied.
Were you ever with her in the studio? Do you know if she listened to music while she was working?
She definitely did. And Pasita introduced me to the delights of Tina Turner. Tina Turner was a big presence in her studio, and it was that era of music, actually. There was always music in her studio. And I think it goes back to being in her early 20s in San Francisco and going to all the jazz bars on Fillmore Street. There were blues. She did a series called Endless Blues, which was about her own physical challenges. Like, this is the last body of work that she made before she sadly passed away. But she embraced blues music as something that she could talk about through these paintings. So music was such an important part of how she worked. It was always loud music coming out of her studios. Like Nina Simone was a big influence, and Joe Cocker. She was a big Joe Cocker fan. And yeah, so I mean, I'm maybe the opposite because I like a bit of quiet in my studio. But with Pasita, I don't think she couldn't work without music playing in the background.
So how did she go about like deciding on her titles or even choosing color? Did she share that with you?
I think, I don't know how she chose them, but they definitely shaped how the work was understood. I think titles, I think she's such a great titleist. I don't know if that's a word, but the works have such amazing titles. There's one work called, and it's one of the centerpieces of the exhibition at PS1 and later on at AGO, but it's a monumental abstract work, and it's called The Sky is Falling, The Sky is Falling. And she actually painted it when she was living in Jakarta in the late 90s when the Suharto dictatorship collapsed and the Indonesian currency also collapsed. And so there's this incredible monumental abstract work that is actually about the economic destitution of a country, but the titling and the colors really come together. There's also another work, and I love it because it actually brings talking about her being a cultural omnivore, but one of her endless blues series was called Blues Train to Jogja. So not Georgia, Jogja as in Jogjakarta, because she combined her love of blues music with her fascination with batik fabric. And so these interesting marriages of references were always present in her practice. And in terms of color, it's interesting. There's a short film of hers that was done, I think, in the early 90s by an American filmmaker named Kaveri Call. And it was produced, I think it was produced by PBS when Pasita was working on a large-scale commission for the Washington, D.C. Metro. And it was a series of films, I think, that talk about female artists of color in the U.S. And the filmmaker asks her, Pasita, what do you think you brought to this country? And she answers very confidently. She says, color. I've given it color. And she definitely saw herself as this ambassador of color. And it's funny because she even, in that same interview, she says that she knew it was time to leave the US. And she ended up leaving Washington, D.C. and moving to Indonesia in the late 90s. She said because the East Coast winters were dulling her sense of color. And she needed to move back to Asia to regain that appreciation of vibrant reds, of rich yellows and like verdant greens. And for her, color was almost what's the word? It's a commitment. Color is the vertebrae on which her practice stands. And you can see that in the work. Like, I have never met a colorist better than Pasita.
Let's talk about you for a little while. Tell me, what are you excited about right now?
So a few things. One is, well, you talked about this earlier, but I'm a very new father. And so that's kind of amazing in terms of changing your perspective on what you're trying to do and how your art relates to the world. But also I'm working on an exhibition that opens in a couple of weeks, which is the Turner Prize, which opens at Tate Britain on the 25th of September. And it's an opportunity to really realize a project in a large scale. And also Pasita's exhibition retrospective is going to its final stop in Toronto. And we're really excited to bring that to the vast Philippine diaspora in Ontario. So 2024 seems to be the year when many of these things happen.
Sounds wonderful. I just love our conversations. It's interesting, the type of practice you have and the connectivity to your art. It's, what is the right word? Intriguing, exhilarating in some ways, exciting. It's great to see the ties between the two of you. So I'm curious, having her in your life and as an influence, how do you keep learning?
I think that's the thing. I think that the process of learning is almost kind of imprinted on the DNA of being an artist, right? Because it's so much of trying to work out how to make an artwork. There's so many layers of learning and unlearning that is woven into it. And I think for me, I keep learning by just being endlessly curious and being committed to collaboration. The more I do exhibitions and the more I make work as an artist, I realize that I'm not just putting artworks in a space, and that relates to curating Pasita's incredible body of work as well. Within the process of exhibition making, I really believe that the work of an artist also involves a heavy amount of community building, and every opportunity to show work is an opportunity to bring imagined communities in a museum or in a gallery space. And so that the possibilities presented by collaboration is really intrinsic to my work as an artist, but also my work as a student of history.
What aspect of your practice do you enjoy the most?
I think maybe it's a cop-out, but I love every part of it. I love the moments where I don't see people for months on end because I'm busy making work in the studio. But I also love the moments where I get to talk about the work with podcasts like this or with giving talks about the exhibition. The moments where I get to celebrate the exhibition with my family, with curators that I've worked with. So yeah, with an artist, it's always so extreme, particularly maybe with my kind of work, because so much of it involves just being tucked away in the studio making stuff. But on the other hand, it becomes a very social practice when you talk about bringing, putting on exhibitions. And so there are these kind of extremes of being introverted and extroverted that you somehow have to bring together. But I genuinely love every aspect of bringing an exhibition to the world because the public is such an important. Not many artists think about their audiences when they make work, but for me, I always love the idea that the public is at the center of what I make. And so making it, but then also sharing it to the world are of equal importance to how I approach making art.
When creating, do you think about who your audience is? Of course you do, right? You're thinking about what your audience is thinking as they view.
Yeah, I think I think I've used this phrase too many times, but I think my work, I'm committed to seducing the audience towards knowledge. And so how do you enact that seduction really with display, by making work that is incredibly intricate, that it draws people in? I even go to the point where I write my own interpretation with the public in mind. And so that element of being generous with information when a member of the public approaches my drawing or my sculpture, I think that conversation for me is central to exhibition making.
Pio, this has been a wonderful conversation. And this is our last question. As an artist, what is your role?
I'm not sure if my answer is an original one, because it might be, I might be borrowing from another artist, but I don't remember which one. But as an artist, I think my role is to bear witness and then to transform that testimony into something that people can look at. And I think that's really the most important thing.
Well, thank you for the work that you do, and thank you for the work that you continue to do for your aunt, Pio Abad. It's been wonderful. I've enjoyed this conversation very much.
Thank you so much, Phyllis.
Thank you for listening to Cerebral Women Art Talks podcast. For additional content, please visit cerebralwomen.com and be sure to follow Cerebral Women on Instagram.